All right, this is actually better than I thought for a Sunday. Like, I thought most people were too busy going home or puking into their toilet. So, which actually is kind of appropriate. We're going to talk about punk. So last year, I did the punk rock panel at the con, and I was very happy with the reaction it got. I was very happy with the attendance that it got. But there was one criticism that I agree with that everyone raised at me, and it's not that I didn't mention their favorite band, and it's not that I didn't spend all this time talking about the subgenre of the subgenre. It's that once I got to the 90s, it had to speed up. Because punk is such a dynamic and evolving genre, I had to find a point which to stop, and I focused very, very heavily on the origins. So a lot of people asked me, can you come back next year and do a sequel? And I decided, yeah, I'm gonna do the sequel, Punk Rock 2, When Punk Popped. The bulk of this panel is gonna be me talking about punk in the 90s and the aughts. And as I said before, deeply personal time for me. I was working in music and I watched it happen. And when you live through something and you're actually in the industry, you see the inner workings of how genres rise and fall, it gives you a different perspective than just, I heard this on the radio and I happen to like it. So I'm gonna start by giving you guys the history of punk, and I'm gonna try to do it in 15 minutes. But honestly, when you go to a punk rock show, 15 minutes is all you need. Because by the time you're done after 15 minutes, you wanna die anyway. Which is how the Warped Tour managed to sustain itself for so many years. 20 minutes, puke, 20 minutes, puke, drink, 20 minutes, puke, and then you realize what you've been drinking has been vodka. Like before, the references, it's the same general references as last time with two major additions. Number one, Nothing Feels Good by Andy Greenwald is like the book on emo. I will be talking about emo. You cannot talk about punk in the aughts without talking about its maligned redheaded stepchild. Because emo was the subgenre that got big. And whenever a subgenre gets big, everyone hates it. No, they love it, they hate it, they love it again. And that actually ties back to another one of the references I use more this time, the Punk Rock MBA. This is a wonderful YouTube channel run by Finn McKenty, hardcore lifer, and it's about music marketing. He does a whole thing on how does a band get big, how does a genre die, and he put out a wonderful video about like this 10-year progression where a band comes out, hits the scene, everybody's mind blown by it, they love it, it peaks, then everyone starts to hate it and it drops. And then after 10 or 15 years, suddenly they become elder statesmen. And he was talking about it in reference to bands that were emo or punk, like NoFX when they came out, nobody took them seriously, they were stupid. Today they're seen as elder statesmen of the genre. He also pointed out, funnily enough, that this cycle of respected elder statesmen is starting to apply to Limp Bizkit. So, so I listened to Limp Bizkit when I was 17.
We all made it.
Everyone listened to Limp Bizkit when they were 17. But now they're starting to get respected. Side note, did you guys see that Super Bowl commercial about the car with the Limp Bizkit CD stuck in the track?
They're not respected, they're a meme now.
I know, but once you become a meme, doesn't that mean that people on some level respect you enough to meme you? If someone's gonna meme me, that means that I mean something. But I digress. Our Band Could Be Your Life was a big book about emo that came out in 2003, 2004. I read it, I devoured it, and I will be citing some of that when I talk here. Smash, again, wrote, that's where the bulk of the 90s information I have comes from, because for some weird reason, screw you, nobody ever wants to talk about how the 90s changed the genre. So let's just get this out of the way and do the history really quickly. Because if there's a few things you need to know about punk, it's this. You need your disaffection, you need your do-it-yourself, and you need your fashion statement. Music was always secondary. The entire goal of original punk was to get noticed and have fun doing it. The early bands, you could count on one hand how many of them had talent. Iggy Pop, The Clash, the Buzzcocks. Everyone else, even the Ramones, had no talent. But you know what? If you could fake it till you make it, that worked. And for early punk, it was the personality that made the genre work. When we talk about early punk, even when we talk about credibility, personality meant a lot. And even though that started to fade later on down the line, it did have a resurgence a little bit later, especially in the last decade. And you see these lifestyle choices and these commitments and these ideas that you want all thrown together to create something new. The punk mindset is what drives the genre. And every single genre, subgenre, and scene has its own set of values. Those values are what drives the scene and can even evolve the scene later. If the scene doesn't have the values, then the scene dies. You again will see that when I talk about punk in the aughts. Because there was a moment where the values spurred on a new genre, and then when the genre split itself off from those values, it petered out and died very quickly. The mindset, the values, the energy, the charisma are what make punk work. And a lot of this has to do with the original punk. Who do you think I'm gonna put up here?
Sex Pistols.
Nope. Nope. The original punk, Mozart. Because I could talk about the original punk bands, but you want the original punk mindset and attitude? You look at Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He did not care what people thought of him. He did whatever he wanted. He lived fast, did a ton of drugs, and died young. Because it's a mindset. And that mindset has always been part of it. I also like how some original punk musicians would talk about Mozart and Mozart's trajectory and fall when talking about how they came into the scene. We may think about the 27 Club now, but he's the original founder of it. Because his music was live fast, die young, and leave a great looking corpse. I'm not sure if his corpse was great looking. Probably wasn't. But hey, at least it's where he got started. And when we look about punk, this would eventually evolve, especially in our world. Now, when you're looking at proto-punk, as I said last time, anything pre-75 that was about music, attitude, and dissonance, and the scene started bubbling up as a way of doing anti-music. This isn't punk yet, but it's laying the groundwork for what could come later. The grotesque lyrics, the theatrics, the roughness, the dissonance, all of this was put into place. This is when bands like MC5 started doing their thing. This is when the Stooges started doing their thing. This is when you started to see The Who lay the groundwork for what would come in later generations with power chords. This is when you would see people like Lemmy Kilmister outstrip the musical creativity of his own band, get kicked out, form a better band, and leave a lasting legacy. That's Hawkwind. This is when Richard Hell started showing that fashion can make just as much a statement as the music that you're playing. Across the pond, you got Malcolm McLaren looking at Richard Hell and saying, I can copy that. It won't be as good, but I can copy that. And this lays the groundwork for the fashion trends that came in later. And when you look at the music here, some of it may not have the punk sound, some of it may not have the punk energy, but it laid the groundwork for the dissonance and the do-it-yourself that would come later. Fun fact, this is a fun random fact. There is a band in the 60s that actually started doing this in like the late 50s, early 60s, and went nowhere with it. It wasn't until they changed their sound and sold out that they became huge. But they would go on to also influence the dissonant pub rock genre. That band, you may have heard of them. They're called the Beatles. And if you've ever seen the original Beatles when they would wear leather jackets and set condoms on fire, you need to look at the original Beatles. Germany Beatles. Because you know them Germans are into some freaky stuff. So by the time punk came out, it was equal parts about the music and the anti-music. The young, loud, and snotty was a comment made by Johnny Lydon, otherwise known as Johnny Rotten, when he was talking about what it meant to be a punk. And you have to see at this point that the attitude was just as important as the music, if not more so, and this is why punk exploded, especially in places like New York and Great Britain, where the repressed energy and the rage of the people listening to it bubbled to the surface and exploded out in this orgasm of anti-music. And that level of disaffection has always fueled the scene, because the music ultimately becomes catharsis. That catharsis allows you to feel better about yourself after you're doing it. And a lot of punk, even to today, has excellent cathartic energy. Because you're jumping up and down, you're screaming, and eventually the endorphins kick in, the negativity boils away, you meet your mates, and everyone starts to get happier about things. During this era, you do have bands like the Ramones, who are trying to be famous and not working, so they just do whatever the hell they want. You have the Sex Pistols starting as a prefabricated attempt to be snotty that worked for like one record. You have the Clash reading a bunch of books about how to be political, so they just go off on their own little world and create some of the greatest music ever with London Calling. You have the Damned, who I started listening to around the time I made this panel, creating some of the poppiest punk I've ever heard, but you don't care because you're getting into what they're saying. G.G. Allen, again, die in a ditch, but scream while you're going. The Buzzcocks, yeah, pop punk's a thing. The Dead Boys, it's a thing. And Devo, your punk band's favorite punk band, where they literally are doing post-punk, punk attitude without punk music, while punk is going on. But I will always bring that back to the great South Park quote, I'm so nonconformist, I'm not going to conform with your nonconformity. But think about that. If the punk mindset is about being your own person, be your own damn person. Now, it again is reflected in what I chose for the 70s era, but it's always fun to see that you have the music starting to push and prod and pull and create a change. But taking a photo. You know, this whole thing is on the Study of Anime Facebook. I posted the playlist last year. You also start seeing the punk rock movies, because of course you got the punk rock movies talking about what it was like to be in one of these bands. My favorite of those is DOA, because DOA, you get to see the self-destruction alongside the band. And that ended up being part of the problem, because punk started to go so far down the self-destructive hole that a lot of bands could do one record and that was it. You did not have enough rage, you didn't have enough disaffection, you didn't have enough of a coherent voice to do a second act. So the band either had to evolve like the Clash did, they had to spread their genre wings like the Ramones, or they were gonna die. And a lot of punk bands died. But then the 80s happened. And when the 80s happened, you started to again see the spreading out of genres. Rock music was probably at its pinnacle at this point. You're seeing a lot of different experimentation popping into rock, and you're starting to see creativity come to the forefront. Like, I was a 17-year-old a-hole who just liked to punch people and scream because the man sucked. I am 28 years old now. That doesn't work anymore. But you know what? I have a pen and I have acerbic wit. And I'm gonna write some stuff that people are gonna remember. This was the era where the attitude replaced the music. And the punk attitude, remember what I said about values? The punk values don't die. They simply become something new. And you see that in all the different subgenres. Try to go legitimate, you get new wave. Try to make it more poppy, you get mod. Try to expand your own musical horizons while sticking true to your snotty attitude, you get post-punk. Decide that everything sucks and you get goth. Say, all you guys don't remember the rage, and you get hardcore, which is literally from across the river in DC. Or you could be like this one band that absolutely loved punk and hardcore, and they incorporated it into their rock sound. The problem was they were also influenced by some of the bands like Black Sabbath and Grand Funk Railroad and Mountain, and they wanted to play bigger, more intense music. So they tried to play at the punk clubs, but the punk clubs said they were too heavy. So then they would go to the metal clubs, and the metal clubs would say you're too fast. So they looked at some of their contemporaries and said, we're just gonna thrash it up. And the band I'm talking about is Metallica. But Metallica, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Anthrax. The founders of thrash were also punk fans. And punk would go on to influence their sound. Then you look at something like Suicidal Tendencies, which is already blending the thrash and metal into their hardcore. So by this point, the rules are now gone, the genre rules are now gone, and everyone can make the music they want, and you see that by the mid to late 80s. So that, of course, would lead to some more great movies, and I would recommend it, like I said last year, End of the Century, excellent movie, we're talking about the Ramones. Also, Return of the Living Dead, Punks versus Zombies, I'm not kidding. So hardcore was one of the genres that spun out of this that is still going strong today. The values are still there, the scene is still there, the sound is still there, it still has that power, it has that edge, it has that rage, and it is still as cathartic as it was back then, because this was the music for, again, 10 years after the original disaffection, new disaffection set in, Ronald Reagan sucked, and everyone wanted to scream about how much Ronald Reagan sucked. So you get hardcore. And hardcore would also evolve and transform and continue to influence. The one thing I have on there that I always point out to people is the Goo Goo Dolls. If you have never heard 80s Goo Goo Dolls, back when they were still called Sex Maggot, I highly recommend you listen to them. They are weird, and the only reason they have the name Goo Goo Dolls is because the venue would not put Sex Maggot on the marquee. So they were thinking about it, and someone had a Goo Goo Doll toy, so they pointed and said, "We're the Goo Goo Dolls." And it stuck. Unfortunately, it also ruined them. I love that band. I love them from the bottom of my heart, but everything after Dizzy Up the Girl Can Die in a Fire. Now, there's actually some really good documentaries from this era. I only touched about it on the surface to try and bring out what the central tenets were, but there's a lot of great documentaries about the hardcore era from the time that transformed and showed how it could grow. And then punk died again. Because by the end of the 90s, you started to see metal making money, you started to see hip hop replacing punk. Punk started this weird little upward tilt, almost suburbanizing itself. And when the crust left and the disaffection started to gentrify, hip-hop was there to replace it. This is the era of Public Enemy, who put out some of the most blistering hardcore with a great beat. You have the NWA, who originally started as a party rap band that eventually turned into something serious and angry. It's hardcore with a hip-hop beat. And things started to transform. And music started to change, and radio started to change. And then something else happened. That. Nirvana happened. And say what you will about Nirvana, we are looking at Nirvana from 2020. This album came out almost 30 years ago. It's hard to put yourself in the mindset of someone who was the right age for when Nevermind came out. Nirvana was born out of a punk scene. It was born out of Pacific Northwest punk. They had their own attitude, they had their own music, they had their own message, they didn't care what you had to say about it, and they played what they wanted to play. It just so happens that they got picked up by a major label. At this point, as metal was becoming a bloated caricature of itself, as hip-hop was creating its own centralized community, music AR scouts were looking for different bands to fill this void or do something new. They heard Bleach, they looked at Nirvana, they said, we're gonna run with this. And they put out Nevermind. When Nevermind came out, it pretty much every music book says, overnight it destroyed hair metal. Hair metal was weird, it was bloated, it was stupid. And then Nirvana came along and just swept them under the rug. And it changed the pop music mainstream, it changed the rock music mainstream, and it changed the fans. This started to lead to a lot of major labels wondering if this alternative movement from the 80s, the left of the dial movement, if you want to follow Our Band Could Be Your Life. And they looked at these alternative acts and said, is there someone there that we could work with? Well, Social Distortion. They've been around since the 80s. They had a documentary made on them. They got signed to Columbia. Their album came out. It was a blend of punk and a little bit of Western, a little bit of country, but it sold better than any alternative band had sold to this point. You're looking at Bad Religion had a career, you're looking at The Offspring were starting to have a career, you're looking at punk bands having a career. Social Distortion releases their self-titled album, sells 140,000 copies, and people are looking and saying, we can make money off this. They look at the millions of copies Nevermind sold and said, we can make money off this. And that's when things started to change. Because by the 90s, the music industry was once again looking for the new wave to ride. In the 80s, they had heavy metal. Rap was still considered urban. And because it had that label on it, a lot of mainstream labels did not want to take the risk. Unless your name was MC Hammer and you danced for nickels. I actually have very acerbic things to say about that, but this is going on the internet. So I'm going to just say, unless you were willing to conform to what the label told you to do, or as Cracked put it, you put out a rap album that didn't scare white people, you weren't going to go anywhere. It's like Will Smith puts out a song about summer and gets a Grammy Award. Meanwhile, Public Enemy puts out their most visceral album to date and no one wants to touch it. Because they were looking for something marketable. And it just so happens that by this point, punk was starting to look a little more marketable. Now, the term the democratization of punk comes to us courtesy of Greg Graffin from Bad Religion. He actually wrote down that when this was starting to happen, punk bands were starting to see contracts dangled in front of their heads that were more money than they'd ever made before. Some punk bands were simply looking to make ends meet, and the option of putting out a major label and making the money off it was huge. And by the summer of '94, everything exploded. By the summer of '94, you started seeing major labels put money into bands. You started seeing them support independent labels. At this point, Epitaph was a label that was started specifically to sell Bad Religion CDs. But then Bad Religion signed off to a Columbia. But Columbia poured money back into Epitaph. And that money they poured into Epitaph allowed Mr. Brett to grow his own label. In the summer of '94, you see Bad Religion having the release of Stranger Than Fiction, which by major label standards was a modest hit. But over at Epitaph, they pumped that money into The Offspring, who put out Smash. Smash sold 18 million copies. It is the best-selling, independently produced album to date. No one has come close. The money they got off of Bad Religion's record deal moving to a major, they increased their distribution, they increased their marketing, they increased their promotion, they bombarded the scene. And we've all heard songs from Smash. Keep 'Em Separated, we've heard Self-Esteem. These were songs that were banner in that year. This was a time when things started shifting again, because there was an untapped market that they finally found a way to punch into. Bored 90s teenagers. So there's a really great line in the song 21st Century Digital Boy. I'm a 21st century digital boy. I don't know how to live, but I've got a lot of toys. My daddy's a lazy middle class intellectual. My mommy's on Valium, so ineffectual. And when you think about the early to mid 90s, that was literally the thing. People were just losing out on the passion that drove them. And then this music started coming out. And kids would hear this on the radio because the labels were pushing it. They would see it in the magazines because the labels were pushing it. They would go to concerts and hear it because the labels were pushing it. And suddenly they feel, oh my God, these people are speaking to me. And it starts to explode. Make a band in your garage, you now have a chance to be famous. It's no longer find a label to support our community. The labels are now pillaging those smaller independent groups to fill their own coffers. And everyone is starting to explode. It's still disaffected, but disaffected in a very different way. And because this disaffection mixed with pop sensibilities, you start to see the genre grow. So, this is one of the videos I chose.
Bob!
Bob!
Bobby!
Bobby! You're out of here.
He spent 15 years getting loaded,
So,
15
one thing
years
about
till
this
his
video,
liver exploded. Now it's
No
Bob
effects
gonna
tried to get MTV
do
to
now
play
that
it,
he can't
and MTV
drink.
said no.
The doctor
Even
said,
though this is probably
what you been thinking about? Bob said,
Years
"That's the
later,
point.
MTV
I wanna
comes to
think
No
about
Effects to
that.
ask for the
Now I
rights to a
gotta
video.
do something
No Effects
now.
shoves a middle finger in their face and says no.
That's the time that someone
But when
changed
this
it.
came out,
I knew what
this
I
never
had.
got super huge, but the
62
scene was making up around it in Southern California, which comes to dominate this substratum of punk fandom for years to
They
come.
would get away, riding around as the trucks drive by. You can hear the motherfuckers go.
I really like this song, even though I'm not a huge fan of this band. So, I had this slide last year. If you saw it, I'm sorry, but I really need to bring this up because I don't like really diffusing the genre into three bands, but when you're looking at punk, especially between 94 and 96, there really were three ways your story could go if you were a punk band. Number one would be your Bad Religions. These are your bands like Bad Religion, Rancid, even NoFX, bands that you'll put out a record, you'll eventually sell 1 million copies, the scene will be supportive of you, you'll tour around the world, and you'll have a career out of it. a lot of the bands that came out of this era started in the 80s. And by the time the 90s rolled around, if they were still there, they had grown, they had matured, they had a built-in fan base, and they were able to spread their wings and build a successful career around them. They would still support the bands that were coming up in the scene. Many of the people in these bands had their own labels, or if they were signed to a major, would ask for an imprint, which is when a major label gives a bunch of money to one guy to start a sub-label. The sub-label gets to do all the marketing and signing and all of the production work. The major label uses their distribution channels to distribute the sub-label, the imprint, and then they take most of the money. But at that point, the imprints were still building and using the popularity to grow. A lot of bands that fall into the Bad Religion side of things would have great careers, but never quite reach that level of superstardom. They would end up opening for bands that were inspired by them. Actually, one of the stories I like to tell about that is I was working at my college radio station, and this was around, I want to say 2002, and MXPX had just put out their album 10 Years and Running. And we got lucky enough to interview them. And MXPX firmly falls into the Bad Religion category. They have a fan base, they've had a great career, they've inspired tons of bands. But my co-host looked them in the face and said, so I got a question for you. How does it feel opening up for more famous bands that cite you as their primary influence? Their drummer smacked my co-host up the side of the head. It's good to know that at least we're getting some exposure. But this is 10 years in, MXPX is opening up for bands that inspired them. Now, sometimes this would work very well in the band's favor because it opens up them to a much larger audience and the other bands start to get big. Or the band can get very jealous of the fact that they almost made it. They did well enough for themselves, but they didn't quite hit superstardom. No, for superstardom, you're looking at things like that. And I waited until now to bring up Green Day, because love them or hate them, there would be no pop-punk massive mainstream genre if it wasn't for Green Day. Green Day hit all the boxes. Fast enough to get you dancing, heavy enough to feel rebellious, snotty enough to feel smug, disaffected enough to want to curse your parents out, poppy enough to be played everywhere on the radio. And Green Day grew out of the punk and hardcore scene. They started playing 924 Gilman in the 80s. They released 2 EPs and a full length on Gilman's own Lookout Records. And then they got big. The moment they got big, they got blacklisted from their own scene. But Green Day, despite the fact that they were a very heavy pop-punk band, never gave up on their own scene. They were going on tour with the band Panty Division, openly gay punk band. Venues said, we don't want this band here, they're too controversial. Green Day said, if you don't let them play, we walk. Green Day was so big that they could do that. Green Day changed the course of the music, but never forgot their roots. To this day, Lookout Records owns all of their original recordings up to Dookie, because they still looked out for the scene. Other bands like this would be The Offspring. You could probably put Weezer in there, because the Blue Album came out that year and was super huge. These are the bands that made it. 10 million, 15 million, 20 million records, touching off fan bases all over the world, to the point where Green Day would never need to release another album. They're set for life after Dookie. That's how big Dookie was. It touched off a whole new scene. But Green Day kept chugging at it. Honestly, Dookie's a great album, but I prefer Insomniac, because Insomniac is their catharsis record, it's their rage record, it's their anger record. I also play Stuck With You whenever I have a friend. I'm like, you did this to me, so you're stuck with me now. But Green Day is when the band makes it famous and continues to push the scene. And then the one I regret, putting Jawbreaker on this slide. Because Jawbreaker had a career. Jawbreaker inspired so many bands on the line. Just to give you an idea, most of the emo bands that you heard in the aughts were essentially copying Jawbreaker, with the heavy chords, but the evocative lyrics and the emotional delivery. Jawbreaker put out 4 records, but they're always remembered for their 4th one. When Dear You came out, Jawbreaker originally said, "We will never sign to a major label." They did, and the scene turned on them. Dear You comes out, lambasted by the community, lambasted by the music press, and it was called a betrayal by their fans. Sold 40,000 copies, kicked off their record label, broke up, and Blake turned into a professor. Then, 2 or 3 years later, Dear You becomes the biggest thing on the planet, touching off an entire generation of bands. If you've never heard it, just listen to Accident Prone. Don't listen to it when you're depressed. I made that mistake once. She got a ton of text messages. But that's the point. That band could be anyone. It could be any band that tried but couldn't quite make it. But the fact that you would have 3 different categories of looking at these bands is indicative of what the scene was like at the time. So again, I had the names, and these are the names you probably remember from last year. Bands that would go on to create careers, and bands that laid the foundation or weren't able to go anywhere. At this point, the scene was at its hottest. So, I guess I don't need to play Basket Case, unless you want me to. I'll play some of it. This song.
Do you have the time to listen to me
It's a punk
whine
chord progression,
about nothing and
but it's about something
everything
that
all
kids in the
at
suburbs can
once?
understand.
I am one of those melodramatic fools, neurotic to the bone, no doubt about it. Sometimes I give myself the creeps. Sometimes my mind plays tricks on me. It all keeps adding up. I think I'm cracking up. Am I just paranoid? Am I just up?
So, it's not as punk as punk, but it got a lot of people to listen to it, and it's still catchy to this day. Doobie still works. So, of course, that, again, take the playlist, because we are actually at 1:30, which is exactly where I wanted to be at this point, because I cultivated videos for the second half of this panel based on my own passions. But after the summer of '94 and the democratization of punk, and people realized you could make money off it, now you start seeing the pop-punk explosion. And the pop-punk explosion often can be credited to 3 letters. TRL. If you guys don't remember TRL, Total Request Live, it is the reason why Carson Daly is famous. But TRL was instrumental in the cultural zeitgeist of the late 90s. If you were a teenager and had cable, you watched it. If you were a teenager and did not have cable, then you were me and you spent the 90s playing Dungeons and Dragons. But if you had MTV, you were watching this show. And TRL became the driving force behind punk's later explosion. Bands started to see, especially after Basket Case, that music videos, especially well-crafted music videos, could bring in more fans. People who didn't necessarily listen to the radio, but would watch TRL and get involved in it. You start to see the genre explode for a second time. But instead of it being all these subgenres flying into orbit like an exploded star, you're seeing different variations on the same thing. To the point where they started writing opinion pieces in the newspaper about how all these bands sound exactly the same. Your kid could tell them apart, but you sure as hell couldn't. And the TRL effect allowed a lot of these bands to explode. Bands that, again, would never have had a career started working on music videos, and that music video allowed them to succeed. There's one band that used TRL to such a great effect that they are still releasing music today. That band is Blink-182. They're a bunch of juvenile idiots who sing about stupid stuff. Unless you listen to their new record. They sing about stupid stuff. But we all saw Damn It, and if you haven't, I'm gonna play it. We all saw What's My Age Again, where they're running naked down the hall, They even did a female version of it for California for She's Out of Her Mind. And then we remember the one for Rock Show where they take $1 million and throw it out the window of a van, then drop the van on the ground while a homeless guy they gave a makeover to watches and laughs. They use the music video and TRL to give themselves a career. This is where the suburban influence firmly comes into its own. And you start to see the genre again pull out. Now that's a Fall Out Boy lyric. You need to take a pill to make this town feel okay, which again talks about that same disaffection. That is the one thing about pop punk and emo that I never connected with. It's like with grunge, I never connected with grunge because I had a great relationship with my father. Like, father of mine, where have you been? One of my friends was like, oh my God, that song speaks to me. I'm like, Gino, your dad is awesome. He didn't abandon you and send you $5. He drove us to that sci-fi convention last week. My dad took me to the Warped Tour. Come on. I could never connect with that because it didn't work with me. The same thing happened with this era because I'm from New York City. I'm never bored. If I need something to do, I walk 10 feet out my house and watch the chickens my neighbor has fight. And the fact that I can do that in Queens. But that, for a lot of people, especially people who lived on the east end of Long Island, or the people who lived in like Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, or the people that lived outside of Chicago where they couldn't get into the city, this was a way of them continuing to express their own disaffection. And then like, MXPX starts making songs about how safe punk is becoming.
We ain't got no place to go. Let's go to the punk rock show. Darling, take me by the hand. Gonna see a punk rock band. There's no use in TV shows. Radio, rodeo. Wanna get into the crowd. Wanna hear it played real loud. We ain't got no place to go.
So on the one hand, for punk fans, this is what they did to have fun. But it also is criticized in its own scene for becoming too safe. By 2003, Northman's puts out a song called Separation of Church and State that says, when did the scene become so safe? When did punk rock become a joke? Because then stopped singing about rage and started singing about listening to Tupacs.
We're going to the punk.
But as they started this whole organization, they're playing to their market and the market loves them. And by this point, again, scene evolution. So yeah, Blink-182 saves the day. They're from not my neck of the woods, but close. Newfound Glory comes out of Coral Springs. And they come out, this is important, they come out of the Coral Springs hardcore scene. And that's rare. You didn't see a lot of scene cross-pollination in the late 90s. But the founding members of Newfound Glory, one of them, Chad Gilbert, played guitar in the hardcore band Shai Hulud and was a huge fan of the bands VOD and Earth Crisis. Big metalcore and hardcore bands. And when Newfound Glory came out, you started to see cross-pollination between genres. And now you're starting to see things flower a little bit. So of course, MXPX needs more love. The Get Up Kids foundationals of, these are another emo foundational band blending together punk rock and hardcore a little bit. You start to see the labels, you start to see the Warped Tour. And the Vans Warped Tour, it's over now, but if you were into punk or skate punk or pop punk, between like 96, 97, and like 2005, that was your thing. That was my Otakon before I started going to Otakon. Like, Otakon was the big deal for anime fandom, that was the big deal for punk kids. And every year, you go to the Warped Tour. For me, it was Randall's Island. You'd inhale clouds of unhealthy dust, pay $12 for a basket of chicken rings, get sunburned on top of your head, and get punched in the face 6 or 7 times. And then you look at your friends and like, do you want to go to the one in Asbury Park? No? Okay, I'll see you next year. And then you go to the one in Asbury Park. So, again, if you haven't seen this video, what I love about this particular video, aside from the fact that it is like probably the catchiest song, they still close every concert with this day. If you look at the guitars, they have bands on those guitars like Strung Out and Propaganda who are big in the punk scene. And they're like talking about how they were being inspired. While they are a bunch of clean-cut kids from California singing about kid stuff. Martin, want this. That's it. Nothing against Mark Hoppus. He is one of my favorite human beings on the planet. I want to say about 10 years ago when Plus 44 came out, it was like 10, 15 years ago. I saw them at Virgin Megastore, and I was going through a real depressive patch, and I'm having him sign, and I'm like, Mark, I just want to say, your music means a lot to me. I have depressed, and when I listen to like Blink-182 when I'm listening to stuff that cheers me up, it makes me feel better about myself, and you have saved me from suicide once. Mark gets up, walks around the table, hugs me, asks me for my ears. He emailed with me several times and he was Mark Hoppus is one of the nicest men on the planet. Which is why what happened to him with Blink-182 is a crock of BS, and why I like the new Blink-182 more. Because that Skiba is not going to turn on you. Why would he? All he has is alcohol. So again, playlist, buy that. You will find your new favorite band on that. Watch that, or maybe not. And of course, one of my favorite Japanese bands. I love these guys. But this is from their 2017 album. So they're still kicking it too.
Where's the boys go? Are you ready tonight? We got that rock to show. Can you hold it down? Here we go again. That time is right. Hey, are you satisfied? Nobody's died. I don't care where you're coming from.
These guys are in their 40s, by the way, and they can still kick it. I would recommend looking for their 2000 record, Making It Road. It has a cover of the Green Acres theme on it. And then the very next song is a cover of Black Sabbath's Changes. So, this is where my last panel ended. Because the industry, by the time the early 2000, 2001, banner year for the music industry. They made more money than they ever did before. 2002, it broke. Why did it break? Napster, at least that's what they said. Why did it break? Releasing crappy albums. I give Carson Daly some flack, but he gave a great quote when he said, bands these days put out an album with 1 or 2 hits and then 10 songs trying to justify that hit. No one is going to buy that album when the 2 songs are the only ones you want. And by this point, that was in fact a thing. Independent bands were still putting out albums. Major label bands were putting out singles. Then they stopped selling singles. And the industry started to break. By this point, you had do-it-yourself, create-it-yourself, and the internet all influencing it. I like this quote. This is a Green Day quote. Does anybody care if nobody cares? Because the disaffection was still there. In fact, that disaffection would continue to be a thing up to the defining moment of that generation, 9/11, and beyond. But you see the divide, and you see the breakdown, and you see things start to transform and change. But it also offered a level of creative freedom that bands never had before. And that freedom, even though the bands sounded the same, allowed them to be themselves. Thanks to iTunes, thanks to sites like Bandcamp, thanks to independent labels that broke away from majors, because now you could get your albums released through iTunes easier, you started to see the scene start to shift. And this, of course, led to a second genre explosion.
Nevertheless, in my dress for the occasion, it's number 32.
Fun fact, they put out an album last year, Order and Decline. Their best work since All Killer No Filler.
It's not about the money, cause it tells the resorts about sweating all the in the
It is such a good record. Just give it a listen. Actually, no, it's their best album since Chuck. Yeah, Canadians know how to rock. I love when I'm playing with this and people like rooting to it. We all know Fat Lip. And if you don't, now you know it. Knowing is half the battle.
Become another casualty of society. I'll never fall in line. Become another victim of your conformity. Back down.
So that's actually kind of a telling song, especially the chorus, never become a victim of your conformity, because that is what pop punk was at this time. Pop punk was juvenile bathroom humor that existed solely because you wanted to express yourself in a way that was seen as rebellious. Even if that rebellion was manufactured and 100% safe and parent approved in some cases, it still gave you the catharsis you were looking for. That's what pop punk was. And out of this scene, you start to see a bunch of bands pop out of it. Now, Good Charlotte popped out of the hardcore scene in DC. Even though their music wasn't hardcore, they popped out of the scene. Simple Plan came out of the hardcore punk scene in Canada. You don't believe me? Look up the band Reset. Exactly, they're like the Canadian Pennywise. And they had 3 members of Simple Plan, though not all at the same time. Jimmy Eat World puts out Clarity in 2000, and then in 1999, and then in 2001 they put out Bleed American. They put out Bleed American the week of 9/11. Oh no, but when you think about how big that album got, especially in an era where we needed to process what we saw, it was incredibly cathartic in moving us past it. I will say, I was listening to that record when I saw the plane go into the first tower. I don't remember anything else from that day, but I remember I was listening to Hear You Me, and then I'm like, what the hell is that? And that's the last thing I remember. But it helped in the coming days allow me to process. Music saved my life. Taking Back Sunday, I'm gonna talk about them later. I'm not gonna talk about them later, but Rise Against continues to put out great music to this day. I might talk about Fall Out Boy, but literally anyone can go here. Because this is when the scene was huge. This is alternative press going monthly. This is absolutepunk.net at the height of its power. This is when the scene became huge. And the playlist is indicative of this. 1, 2, that. This is the era where it was everywhere. This is when Fall Out Boy was still a punk band. Hope this is the last time, 'cause I'd never say no to you. This conversation's been dead on arrival. Now, here's the funny part. It is, according to my clock, 1:47. And I've still got 12 more slides. But let's go. Because this is where the genre explosion starts to really kick in. The early 2000s genre explosion was just amazing. Because you started to see punk go in so many different directions again. And each of those directions, like in the 80s, was a way of re-expressing itself. Now the thing about this era was not a lot of cross-pollination. Because again, the scenes for some reason didn't want to intermingle. Case in point, look at power pop. Power pop it's pop with a little punk. Just enough to get in on the bandwagon, or in some cases, punk bands becoming more poppy to increase their exposure. Power chords, emo lyrics, pop hooks. And this era could best be described with this song lyric. While she may not be Miss Right, she'll do right now. Exactly. And this era gave us bands like SR-71, Bowling for Soup, and the Ataris in the mid-aughts. I have Bowling for Soup and the Ataris in there because Bowling for Soup was a punky band, but not quite punk. You also put Treble Charger from Canada in there. The Ataris started as a Green Day-esque punk band in the 90s, and then they put out hits.
All the nights we stayed up talking, listening to 80s songs, and quoting lines from all those movies that we love. It still brings a smile to my face.
Now, the Ataris still had a huge scene following that pretty much included that trip.
I guess when it comes
I was
down
one
to it, being grown up isn't half as fun as growing up. These are the best
song? That is a rock and roll song by a 90s punk band that went all over the radio. More people remember their cover of Boys of Summer. Yeah.
It's the one that gets played more now.
Yep. Then we have post-hardcore. So like post-punk was punk values, but not punk music. Post-hardcore was hardcore scene, hardcore values, not hardcore music. And it could best be emphasized by the concept of nothing feels good. Ladies and gentlemen, this is emo. This is nascent emo. And when I was there at the show where Taking Back Sunday almost killed everyone because we were jumping up and down and throwing ourselves against the wall of the knitting factory, there was no air conditioning, it was 110 degrees in there, and Adam Lazzara looked like he was about to die. But this was an era where the hardcore scene gave birth to the band, and the band kept the hardcore values, but had a lot of pop punk influence. The thing is, pop punk kids hated this. In fact, everyone did for some reason. Emo was horribly maligned in its day. But today, people look back on these bands and say, oh my God, they were groundbreaking. Look at what they did for the genre. Glassjaw, Taking Back Sunday, and Brand New. These are bands that in their day were scene bands. They had that moniker. They're a scene band. But look at what they've done.
When everything you get is everything that you want, it pretends. Would you prefer my finger on the trigger or me face down, down across your floor? Me face down, down across your floor. Me face down, down across your floor.
Thanks to this band, I am listening to this record.
Will you tell all your friends you've got your guns in my head? This all story with the
emotional raw lyrics like the Jaw Licker. Hardcore values, hardcore hardcore sensibilities. And it never had a proper crossover with pop punk until recently. Because for some reason, purists wanted to keep the genres separate. Now, post-hardcore also gave birth to its redheaded stepchild, Screamo. And I'll always remember the international superheroes of hardcore with their song, Screamo, Screamo, Gotta Go. But Screamo is the even more maligned cousin of post-hardcore. And the thing about it is, it's really hard to tell them apart, especially early Screamo. Later Screamo, you had the scream and clean divide, you had amazing production values, you had the swept hair and the guy liner. Pretty much picture Green Day when American Idiot came out, and that's the Screamo look. The lyrics were almost fatalist at times. Instead of being raw about heartbreak or emotion, they would talk about life not being worth living. This is a line from Hawthorne Heights, cut my wrists and black my eyes so I can fall asleep tonight. And again, these bands were going on to influence further genres. While post-hardcore was giving catharsis to one group, this was giving catharsis to another. And again, hard to tell them apart. But the video I'm going to play for you kind of shows the difference because of the screaming and the chords. It is probably my favorite Screamo song of all time. This is for the word fortune traveling by thirst. This is a song about how corporate culture will kill you. Drowning while chicken to death, just enough to comment. This is the reason why I can't remember my job. Everyone I've had to this gave the voice to trade you something to experience it for the first time. Did you notice how it's slightly different to Taking Back Sunday? It's louder, it's heavier, it's more raw, it's more violent. Post-hardcore went back. This didn't. This kept going because of that. Post-hardcore would go on to influence, or in the case of AFI, they just got weird. But go on to influence a generation of bands like The Used, My Chemical Romance, Cocaine, and this is when you know the song. You can sing the song. So,
Once upon a time, in the city of Los Angeles.
Marty, listen to me.
never seen
Bring
this.
me
This is MC
something
Mars.
the kids will
From
cry for.
2006.
Get out there and get us stoked.
Meet Marty, major label A&R scout. 40 years old, gut hanging out. Red Ferrari Marty, living in LA. Bumps another town to get through the day. Dumped by his girl, he paid for her liposuction. His friends call him money in his introduction. And Marty knows nothing but claims to know it all. Lose a flat screen TV if he drops the ball. You're as good as your last hit, find the next big thing. If he doesn't bring the bling, his cell phone won't ring. What's the trend, what's new, what's a label scout to do? Office Life Marty, 1132. The label press calls and yells.
Sign more emo.
How about Screamo?
If it's L sign Nemo, we're down 2%. And BMG knows my daughter likes dashboards, so get me one of
He
those.
checks APNet, the scout, and more. Yelling band names to his
I love
assistant through the
this
door.
song.
The kids will like this. Who cares if it's great? So he signs a band
the
called
same
Hearts That
album
Hate.
had the song Hot
Marty,
Topic is not
we've
punk rock
got a
on it.
hit.
So you see, Screamo became an insult also. Although I would listen to this song. I really would. I would like punk songs. So this, of course, starts burgeoning up with metalcore, which has actually been around since the 90s. Bands like Earth Crisis, Freya, VOD, Kill Switch Engage. Not melodic death metal, but that's how people have described it. It's hardcore breakdowns, snarling lyrics, melodic solos and choruses. It's what happens when hardcore wants to play metal, but the hardcore scene won't let them. And it possesses its own subgenres as well, with a lot of great bands in there like Kill Switch Engage, Bring Me the Horizon, and Hatebreed. These are the foundational bands of the metalcore that got big, and as Screamo started to fall off the wagon, metalcore got huge. And then you have bands like Mice and Men playing stuff like this. Now, think about this time period. This is where the scene became bigger than its inspiration. This starts divorcing itself from the hardcore scene, divorcing itself from the punk scene, and going on to something else. See here, you got your breakdown right there, your metal breakdown. These guys play Southern Red State rock now. It's actually kind of cool. They used to go on tour with Bring Me the Horizon. No. What other band do I like? That metal band that nobody likes. No. So this led to mallcore or scenecore, or as the punk rock MBA calls it, boy bands with breakdowns. This is an era where image was more conscious than music, and the bands were influencing each other, but it had no hardcore values, it had no scene connection. It was literally an image and some music, much like early punk. And your adherence to the scene was your adherence to the fashion. And this is an era where things got a little weird. I actually was done with the genre by this point. I had not listened to punk in years. I was too old for this, and I was listening to a lot of anime music. And then I saw this. This is the band Attack Attack. The song is called Stick Stickly. Apparently, this is the genre called crabcore. Although, I also like this song. I'm not going to say I don't. I really like this song. I like breakdowns. And then suddenly, we sing it again. I like this song, so I'm not going to say anything else. So what do you have coming out at the same time as scenecore? You have easycore. Why is it called easycore? Because it's not hardcore. It's literally pop punk with breakdowns. But it's not hardcore, it's easycore. And the thing about easycore is, it's carefree and happy, but often not cathartic. This is the neon colored t-shirts with the zombie monsters on it. This is when you have songs like Break Beat Down in the Key of Happy. where it's angry and violent, but it's also really entertaining and enjoyable. And Easycore had its day from like 2007 to like 2012. It's actually named after Newfound Glory's Easycore tour. And remember I said Newfound Glory would come back? Yeah, they started this whole thing with their love of breakdowns and whatnot, and some great bands in there, aside from Newfound Glory's. 4 Year Strong, Set Your Goals, Daggermouth, Fight Fair. There's a lot of good stuff in here. But I just wanted to play one clip for you that shows you what I mean about pop punk with breakdowns. It's a Fight Fair song. So, I put my own slide in for a day to remember for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, this band covers all the hits. They are pop punk with breakdowns, they're hardcore, they're metalcore, they're every single punk genre from like post-hardcore on is this band. And I love them because not only are they part of that scene, but they pay homage to it to the point where now they have their own recording studio where they will produce your record on the cheap, just so you have a chance to get exposure. Like Green Day before them, they're giving back to the community. And I always, of course, my favorite A Day to Remember song is actually this one. So again, they're a little bit of everything, which brings me to the final genre, sad boy. I'm 90% sure Finn McKenty came up with that one, but this is the defend pop punk era. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is, remember how I said pop punk and post-hardcore didn't click? This is what happens when pop punk and post-hardcore click. Pop punk in the early aughts was about youthful exuberance, being a child, and being snotty. Emo, post-hardcore was about emotions, questioning yourself, and trying to get catharsis out of your music. They didn't click until they did. Sad Boy is literally mature pop punk. It has the breakdowns from easycore. It has the speed and chord progressions of pop punk. It has the emotional, heartfelt lyrics that are found in post-hardcore. And the thing is, it works. That is a lyric from the song Late Nights in My Car by Real Friends. I'm not who I could be, not who I should be, but I'm not who I was. And anyone who's in there, like, pop punk is when you're in high school. Sad Boy is when you just got out of college. And you're trying to discover who you were. And there are a lot of great bands that came out of this. But I watched the stupid Sad Boy video that Finn McKenty put out last year, and I always grab an album from one band that he talks about. And it's right at my birthday. It's my birthday, and I treated myself to an album. And this album was called Life's Not Out to Get You. Yes. By this band from Wales, Neck Deep. And they have quickly become my favorite band. And I'm going to play for you one clip from a Neck Deep song. There is a Gundam in it.
I've seen a punch or two, narrowly escaped a few, and if you can't get that day up, I could show you a few. I remember the football games, the first time that I got laid, and that Sarge broke his finger drinking by the lake. Dang
to that song and picture yourself in your late 20s wondering where you want to go. It's poppy, it's catchy, you can sing along to it and have a good time, but the lyrics are about trying to find the next step and knowing you can't give up where you came from. That is post-hardcore lyrics in a pop-punk song. The song's called Can't Kick Up the Roots. And it is the third song off Life Sent Out to Get You. I like that album and I like Wishful Thinking, because those two albums really speak to that. Also, my D&D character is quite literally the song Damsel in Distress. And then when I was in Japan, the song Growing Pains I sent to my girlfriend when she felt sad. But, so that's the whole thing about it. There's a lot that goes into it as a genre. There's a lot that goes into there. I don't think I do I have the video here. No. Here's the thing. This cuts off around 2015. I'm sure there's more. In fact, there is more. But there's 4 things you need to remember. Punk is not dead. It's not. It's going through a transformation. Who here knows Post Malone? He's a hardcore kid. What's his name? Little Nas X, also a hardcore kid. You're starting to see SoundCloud rap replacing rock as a dominant genre for kids, but the kids that listen to it listen to hardcore, they listen to punk, they see it grow. You still have punk bands to this day putting out excellent music. It might not have the saturation it once did because it's a lot easier to rap into a computer than it is to form a band, but the ethics and the values are still there. And as long as the values in the scene is still there, you're going to see the scene evolve, and that's the point. Punk is not dead. It's just evolving into something else. So this is the quote-unquote final playlist. There's 2 of these. I'll put them up on the Study of Anime page when I get home tonight. And these are just some of the other ones I'm going to recommend just taking a look at, because there's this, and then there's this. And there's a lot of stuff out there if you're willing to look. And I'm just gonna end this off with my Rex for 2019. So my 2019 Rex, Knocked Loose, a different shade of blue. Knocked Loose is one of the best hardcore bands I have heard in years. You will love their music. It is insanely catchy and listenable. And you can grab the album for like $8 off Bandcamp. Pop, morbid stuff. The weirdest pop punk I've ever heard, but they have a song on there called Bloody Mary, Kate, and Ashley. Sum 41's Order in Decline, as I said, best record they put out since Chuck. It's blistering, it's savage, it's angry, and Brown Sound is back, so you know it's not gonna suck. The new Blink-182 album is not really a punk record, but Travis Barker knows what kids like, and Travis Barker is probably one of the greatest drummers alive right now, and he had a major creative influence on this. There's a song that nobody likes off this record called Blame It On My Youth, but when I'm listening to that song, I love every second of it because it's a nostalgia trip. And it makes you think about how you got into the scene and what makes you who you are. But then you listen to something like First Time or Happy Days, which are about Mark Hoppus's depression, and you see that there's still catharsis to be found. It's not a perfect album, but it's got, out of the 16 or 15 tracks, there's at least 10 of them that are excellent. There's only one that's kind of eh. The rest of it's a great record if you give it a chance. And finally, Fury's Failed Entertainment is modern post-hardcore done phenomenally well, showing that even post-hardcore still has its day in the sun. So I went 10 minutes over this time, but I covered everything that I wanted to cover. I don't think I'll do a third punk panel unless you want to do a punk listening party where all we do is living. Okay then. Coming, MAGFest 2021, the punk listening party, where, you know what, you guys bring your own Rex too. We will just hook it up to your phone, and as long as it's clean, we will sample each other's love of the genre. Also coming next year, I'm going to do a metal panel that's like this. Not fantasy metal for fantasy gamers. I'm literally gonna look at the history of heavy metal as a genre. Because some of you know me as an anime panelist. I'm done with anime. I'm retiring from anime cons at the end of this year. My passion is being driven by music and gaming now.
Yeah.
So, what I love about MAGFest is it's the music and gaming festival. It's literally everything I want. So just keep a look at the Study of Anime Facebook. I will probably ask for Rex as the panels go up for next year, but hopefully you guys at least enjoyed the second half of my punk talk, and maybe you got some new music to listen to. Otherwise, safe travels home. If any of you are going to Katsu, I'll see you there.